I'm your host and a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with my colleague Steve Ellner to discuss his recent work on U.S. imperialism and the current political situation in Venezuela. Steve Ellner is a historian and political scientist who taught for over 2 decades at the Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela and is the author of numerous books and articles on Venezuelan politics, the Latin American left, and the Chávez era. He also serves as an associate managing editor of Latin American Perspectives and is the editor of the upcoming January 2027 issue of LAP titled The Many Faces of Chavismo. For today's episode, we'll be exploring what it means to say that U.S. imperialism has entered a new stage, with a particular focus on the growing role of sanctions and economic pressure. We'll also turn to Venezuela as a central case of U.S. imperialism, discussing recent developments, the evolving role of the country's political opposition, including figures like María Corina Machado, and the broader political and geopolitical implications for Latin America. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Steve, great to have you back on the Latin American Perspectives podcast.
Good to be on the program, Alex.
So, to start a conversation, I really want to get into this recent piece you published with Counterpunch, where you argue that U.S. imperialism has entered a new stage. I think this is a really important and accurate way of framing the current moment. I myself have been thinking about these sort of things, and your piece kind of gave form to some thoughts I had been having and actually, helped me think through some of these things in greater depth. And so what do you see as being new or different about this current imperialist moment compared to earlier instances of U.S. intervention in Latin America? What is it that makes this new stage so compelling for you?
Certainly. I think that first a historical background will help shed light on the idea that imperialism is entering a new stage, or perhaps the correct term is phase, but a concept that Samir Amin developed and referred to as hyper-imperialism. He developed that about 20 years ago. Firstly, what is imperialism? Of course, Lenin developed the concept of imperialism as a stage of capitalism in which the entire world has already been carved up. By the early 20th century, each of the European countries had spheres of influence throughout the world. And so Lenin's concept was, firstly, this is a new stage of the system because it's an imperative. It's no longer something you can do, maybe it's a policy. No, the economic situation in each European country is such that the internal market is saturated and capital has to go abroad. It's a question of do or die. And this is going to lead to war, because if the world is already carved up, then where do you go? Countries are going to expand at the expense of other countries, and that's going to create a war type situation. And I may add that this idea of an imperative, I think, is reinforced by the concept which Lenin also made reference to, which goes back to Marx, of course, which is the tendency of the declining rate of profit. So if profit is declining, then there is no incentive or little incentive to invest. And investment abroad through imperialism, the very idea of imperialism produces super profit. So that's a corrective to the declining rate of profit, which kind of eliminates incentives to invest domestically. It injects adrenaline into the system. It creates optimism, and that produces investment. So in that sense, Alex, little has changed. I mean, we're in a situation today of crisis, just like Lenin discussed when he wrote his famous work on imperialism at the time of World War I. We've got a debt crisis, a crisis of legitimacy, and the list goes on. So in that sense, the situation is the same. But there are unique aspects of the current situation, which I think that differentiate the situation today in the 21st century from the past. And that is that historically, there's always been superpowers, and there's always been competition among them. But today we have a superpower that is way above the military might of any other nation. The United States has no competition in the military field. That wasn't the case during the Cold War, although I may add that the Soviet Union was far behind the United States militarily, and that had a lot to do with what happened. It had a lot to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But there was a competition. Today, there isn't in the military field, but there is when it comes to the economy. I mean, China is an emerging competitor to the United States. And so you have a rather unique situation in which you have a military power with no competitor, with no rivalry, but there is rivalry on the economic front. And there's rivalry with regard to legitimacy, because the United States has lost all claim to legitimacy under the second Trump administration. And China is going in the opposite direction as a defender of the rules of international order, a defender of national sovereignty, which the United States opposes even on the theoretical front. So you have a unique kind of situation. In the past, you had superpowers. Great Britain was a superpower, militarily dominant, but with rivalry. They fought, wars throughout those centuries. They won some of them, others came to a standstill, etc. But that's not the situation today on the military front. So that is a unique situation. I think that this is really the essence of the concept of hyper-imperialism, that militarily you have a superpower without any rivalry among the other superpowers. And yet there is rivalry on the economic front and on other fronts.
Now, kind of building upon what you've already just laid out for us, one of the arguments I think you made in the piece, and you've certainly made in the past, is that with regard to imperialism, what we used to think or talk about was a shift away from direct military intervention and a movement towards sanctions and extreme economic pressure, which can be certainly less visible, but still incredibly powerful in terms of material outcomes, in terms of human well-being and economic well-being. And how does this shift change the way imperialism operates in practice?
Firstly, this relates to the very point that's being made about a unique situation that isn't completely unique, just like what I said about imperialism. Fundamentally, nothing's changed, but there are important changes in the system, and thus we can talk about a new phase or a new stage. And with regard to the mechanisms, non-military mechanisms, such as sanctions, most important being the use of sanctions, this has become a new form of warfare that is producing damage, material, humanistic damage, which is comparable to that of military warfare. Because the use of sanctions goes back. The Eisenhower administration used it against Cuba back in 1960. And then the Helms-Burton Act in 1996 took the use of sanctions to a new level, which is secondary sanctions. That is, penalizing, threatening other companies and other countries throughout the world with sanctions if they had economic relations with Cuba. And incidentally, keep in mind, the Helms-Burton Act, Helms comes from Jesse Helms, the notorious racist, who was a co-sponsor of that legislation that Clinton signed into law, and that the European Union resisted, took it, or was about to take it to the European Union was going to take that to the World Trade Organization. And then after that, just dropped the case. So they basically accepted the use of secondary sanctions. But under the first Trump administration, sanctions were taken to a new threshold. And this was promoted by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and furthered by Elliott Abrams and John Bolton, and that is the use of overcompliance. That was Trump's innovation when it came to sanctions. And basically, what that means is that the threat of imposing secondary sanctions, the very possibility that this could happen, dissuades companies and dissuades countries throughout the world from having any kind of relations, economic relations, in this case with Venezuela. And this was furthered, it was a conscious policy, and it was carried out by the use of ambiguous statements in which Pompeo and others in the Trump administration said that they were going to follow the money trail to determine what transactions are leading back to the pockets of President Nicolas Maduro. Now, that was absurd. Maduro was not personally benefiting from these economic relations, but it was intentionally raised as an issue. There were meetings that took place in order to uncover this possible connection with Maduro. And that was the obvious intention, to create fear among companies throughout the world. And it was successful. It was completely successful in that sense. For instance, oil for food swaps, which the Maduro government pursued because food was not sanctioned. It was not covered by the sanctions. And so Venezuela sold oil, or didn't sell oil, they bartered for food. And companies were told that they ran the risk, they were warned that they could be sanctioned. And companies that were being investigated for violating the sanctions were told that if they halted all economic dealings with Venezuela, not only in the area that was being sanctioned, but all dealings with Venezuela, that those penalties would be suspended or could be suspended. So this was an intentional policy in order to convert the system of sanctions basically into an economic blockade. And that's what Maduro himself called it, an economic blockade of Venezuela. Now, under the second Trump administration, there's a new theater of action, and that is the use of these shadow fleets consisting of an estimated 1,000 vessels, which are transporting goods to and from these countries that are being sanctioned. And these shadow ghost fleets are being demonized from Washington as if they're doing something immoral and as if they're doing something illegal. Well, illegal in the United States, but this is international commerce. So the term illegal is really a misnomer. But these fleets shut off their tracking system. They change flags. Sometimes oil is transferred on the high seas. The money transaction, money is transferred in cash because, the U.S. system of the international system of commerce is based on the dollar, the SWIFT clearance system. And so in order to circumvent that, these transactions are taking place in money, in kind, in money rather than through any other mechanism. And Venezuela was beginning to get around that. And the proof is that the economy was picking up from 2020 to 2025. There was an improvement, and the transactions were taking place in the Chinese currency yuan, as well as in cryptocurrency, specifically Ether, which is a decentralized open source system. And that has a lot to do with Trump's decision to strike Venezuela militarily and kidnap President Maduro and the First Lady, Celia Flores. So that is a new phase. I mean, that is really taking an old system, which is sanctions that in the case of Latin America goes back to the Eisenhower administration, but taking it to a new level, which resembles war. Because in fact, ships were being taken over, seized on the high seas. This is a military action. The other aspect, Alex, that has created controversy on the left is to what extent are these sanctions damaging to the economy? There is empirical evidence, empirical studies that demonstrate the devastating effect of the sanctions. But the opposition leaders in Venezuela and the Washington narrative is that these sanctions are not responsible for the economic problems that Venezuela, for instance, or Cuba is facing. You know, in the case of Cuba, Marco Rubio just came out with the absurd statement that the blackouts in Cuba that last 16 hours has nothing to do with the quarantine of oil imports, that it's because of, blaming the victim, blaming the Cuban government for those blackouts. And the same thing in the case of Venezuela. The opposition in Venezuela claims that the sanctions are not responsible, that it's mismanagement and corruption that are causing the economic difficulty. But on the left, there's also a debate. And there is a sector of the opposition, a sector of the left, people who demonize Maduro and recognize the sanctions and are opposed to the sanctions, but they say that this is just one factor, that the misgovernment and the corruption are other factors. And so you have to discuss all these factors separately, individually. But that underestimates the situation. And the fact that the sanctions go back much further than what these leftist people on the left who are opposed to Maduro are saying. They're saying that the sanctions really began in 2019. They did it. Firstly, the financial sanctions of the first Trump administration were imposed in August of 2017. But the Obama decree, they call it in Spanish decree, the executive order, was issued in March 2015. And I think that the misconception here has a lot to do with not understanding the way overcompliance functions. Because the Obama executive order declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security, something that, of course, was and is absurd, but it's being reissued so that Venezuela theoretically is still a threat to U.S. national security. But what these analysts on the left who demonize Maduro and claim that sanctions are only just part of the problem, just one problem among others. The point they miss is that, okay, the Obama executive order didn't target directly the Venezuelan economy. But US companies in particular, the president of their country has stated that Venezuela is a threat to US national security. Obviously, that's going to influence their investment or de-investment in this case, in the case of Venezuela. This is exactly what happened. Kimberly-Clark, Ford, General Motors, Kellogg, and the list goes on and on. US companies closing shop, firstly reducing output and then closing shop and leaving Venezuela. That had a tremendous effect on the Venezuelan economy beginning in 2015. The economic situation in Venezuela had not declined seriously in 2015. It declined in perhaps 2016 or late 2016, 2017. But the effects were already being felt because of those sanctions, the sanctions of Maduro, which were of Obama, which were sanctions against individuals in the Maduro government, as well as the statement that Venezuela was a threat to US national security. So this is, a debate going on among analysts on the left. And I think that, and just to finish with regard to that question, I think the broader picture has to be taken into account. And the broader picture is, it's not just economic. They're all intertwined. The opposition called protests in 2014. They lasted 4 months. They involved violence on the part of the opposition and perhaps overuse of force on the part of the Maduro government, which Maduro himself recognized. There were 36 deaths. 11 of them were security forces. So without going into any detail about the so-called guarimba of 2014 that lasted 4 months, what has to be taken into account is that as a result of that, a narrative came out of the corporate media, which demonized Maduro. And that demonization was a sine qua non for the sanction regime that came after that. If the media hadn't demonized Maduro, imposing those sanctions would have been unlikely. Same thing with what's happening in Iran, same thing with what's happening in Cuba.
Before I move on to the next question, I just want to respond to a few points because I found that really, really helpful. I think ever since you and I first started having conversations, I've always found your approach to this issue to be really principled with regard to these debates on the left about the legitimacy of the regime in Venezuela. Is it the effects of sanctions as well as the possibility of corruption or authoritarianism within the Venezuelan state? But I think it's really important for our listeners to take on this idea really seriously of sanctions as a form of warfare, especially this modern form of it. I've always found that framing, which you were the first person who posed that to me, to be really, really useful and instructive, because at the end of the day, even though it isn't direct military violence, it produces incredible harm with regard to human well-being, and it is a strategy of compulsion and through informal violence, right? You could call it structural violence, but imposing hardship and pain and suffering on the people of whether it's Venezuela or Iran or Cuba, right, to sort of force the hand of the state or of the populace to oust the regime. I also wanted to say I found your framing of how important guarimba. Yeah, I was an undergraduate student at that time in Ecuador, relatively close to Venezuela, certainly closer than I am now here in California, and I do distinctly remember that moment because that was 1 or 2 years after the passing of Hugo Chavez, right, where Maduro was this new president in power. And it seems like since that moment, he's never been able to recover with regard to his public image in the West or the global North, right? Ever since then, Maduro was just viewed as this incredibly authoritarian figure in the mainstream media. And so I just found your framing of it in that way really, really insightful and useful, looking back on 10 years of this now. But moving on to my next question, you've already brought Venezuela into the conversation, but in all of your work, but certainly in your recent piece, Venezuela is central to your analysis. And for those, since you and I haven't had the chance to actually sit down and do a pod on just the current state of Venezuela and everything that's been going on the past 5 to 6 months, can you give us a broad overview of the situation there right now and why it remains such a focal point of U.S. policy? We've seen, like many people describe, this new phase of escalation in U.S. Venezuela relations. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on how you're interpreting these developments and how do they fit in the longer trajectory of U.S. Venezuelan relations and that sort of thing.
Sure. Firstly, I think it has to be pointed out, as I was hinting at previously, that Maduro's success in circumventing the elections, the sanctions, I'm sorry, what was really the cause of the actions on January 3rd, 2026. The system of sanctions, as we've already mentioned, is so important to U.S. foreign policy, and it's become more important than ever before. When you think of Russia, when you think of Iran, it's got a global reach. That the ability of the Maduro government to recover from the hyperinflation that peaked, I believe, in 2019, by 2025, the inflation was pretty much under control. I mean, there's still inflation, but hyperinflation as of, that broke all records with regard to inflation, was eliminated in Venezuela. Oil production, which reached a bottom level of 400,000 barrels a day, was up to over 1 million barrels a day, which was much lower than historically, but still there was a recovery process that was taking place. And 80% of that oil was getting sold to China through this shadow fleet that I mentioned before, in which, bypassing insurance companies and the SWIFT clearance system and everything else. So Maduro's relative success was a threat to the United States, considering that sanctions have become an instrument of U.S. foreign policy worldwide. The second point that should be pointed out is that January 3rd, the operation took place in 2.5 hours. It began 2 o'clock in the morning. There were no U.S. deaths. And there were 23 Venezuelan security people were killed and 32 Cuban security people who were killed. I say this, or I emphasize this, because it shows how much the U.S. had the upper hand, which of course the U.S. has, there's no question about it, but the employing of cyber mechanisms completely paralyzed the Venezuelan resistance. It paralyzed communication among the Venezuelan forces. And the other fact to bring into the picture is that 150 U.S. aircraft of the U.S. Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps were used. And this cyber attack is what Trump referred to as a secret weapon. And he said he had a name for it. He called it the discombobulator. And he said he wasn't given permission to talk about it. But he did say that there was a secret weapon that was used. So I think this is important to point out for a number of reasons. Firstly, there are some people on the left who point to the fact that this was such an easy operation, and it shows that there must have been traitors. And some even point the finger at people higher up. I mean, obviously, they were getting information. The U.S. intelligence had information about Maduro's whereabouts. But that could have been anybody. That could have been any, military officer. But some point the finger at Delcy Rodriguez herself, which is absurd. I mean, I say it's absurd because there's no proof for it. No proof at all. And neither her nor anyone else in the upper echelons of the Maduro government. And the second point that's raised, that this information I think refutes, is that this shows that Maduro didn't have the kind of following that he was leading people to believe that he had. Because if he had a following, there would have been more resistance. And what this information demonstrates is that there was no possibility of inflicting damage on the United States of any kind of retaliation, any kind of effective resistance. And there is a report, I don't know whether it's true or not, but there is, from a reliable source, that Maduro gave instructions to his people not to continue to resist because he saw it was a losing battle. And the point was raised that this is exactly what Chávez did on April 11th, 2002, when he did the same thing. The military threatened to bomb the presidential palace, and he gave himself up. So, I mean, I don't know whether this point that I'm making about Maduro is true or not, but in any case, the facts demonstrate that the Maduro government didn't have a chance in the world to resist what happened on January 3rd. The second point, and it's related to the first, is that Delcy Rodriguez has a gun pointed at her. And she has been told, at least at the beginning, she was told, that she was, there was a possibility that she would suffer the same fate or worse than what Maduro suffered. Obviously, they were threatening her life, saying that this could happen to her. Navy ships are still in the Caribbean outside of Venezuela. So that the kind of legislation that she has passed, oil legislation, mining legislation, that modifies and actually undoes the nationalistic legislation and policies of the Chávez government, can fully be understood as something in which she either accepts or the consequences will be what I just mentioned. Now, there's been a complete shakeup in the government. 17 ministers have been replaced. Members of the military commanders have been replaced. New diplomats have been selected who aren't Chavistas, such as Enrique Ochoa Antich and Timoteo Zambrano, who were named ambassadors to Germany and Spain. They were members of the opposition. And going back, they were members of the pretty radical opposition under Chávez, and they modified the positions. But they were members of the opposition, leading members of the opposition. So it's hard to say. I mean, one of the points that I raise in that article that you mentioned is that there are gray areas that analysts have to recognize. There are certain facts that we just don't know. I mean, that's always the case in any kind of analysis, but even more so in this case. And those gray areas had to do with the military. I mean, the analysis of the Maduro government, we don't know, unless somebody has inside information, which I don't have to that degree, to say what conditions, if any, the military was placing on Maduro, because Maduro counted on their loyalty. So there are gray areas that we don't have access to. And specifically with regard to the wiggle room that Delcy Rodriguez has, I mean, how far can she go? There are reliable people who I've spoken to, who have spoken to upper echelons members of the Maduro government, who have told them, these people, that everything that Delcy Rodriguez does is negotiated, that she can't take a step without Washington telling her just how far to go. And the fact that, Trump has stated this, Delcy Rodriguez's communication is with Marco Rubio. And we all know what Marco Rubio's agenda is. His agenda is regime change. Trump doesn't necessarily support that idea, but Rubio does. And he did, made his political career talking about regime change in Venezuela, and more recently about Venezuela, about Cuba, and more recently about Venezuela. So that there's all the reason in the world to believe that Delcy Rodriguez has very limited options. I mean, we know she has limited options, but I would add the word very limited, saying that that's probably the case. I mean, probably she doesn't have she has very little wiggle room. So what does it come down to? If she's accepting the terms dictated by Washington, what's the purpose? Why is she there in the first place? Why doesn't she just resign? And it seems to me that the answer is quite simple. Maria Corina Machado has been a member of the radical opposition going way back in time. And she has stated repeatedly in the past that if she gains power in Venezuela, she will cut heads. She will, her slogans are no to immunity, no negotiations with the members of the Maduro administration. She said that she doesn't want to see Maduro killed. She wants to see him in jail. So that kind of language definitely points to the very real possibility that if she or the people that she controls, such as the presidential candidate Edmundo González Urrutia, reach power, there will be a bloodbath of the style of Pinochet in Chile. And Craig Murray, who's a human rights advocate, a Scottish former diplomat, has stated on the basis of his interviews in Venezuela that the Venezuelan Chavistas are preparing for a possible military invasion. They assume that there will be a bloodbath if the opposition returns to power. So that this is what people think in Venezuela. The Chavistas think this in Venezuela. And if that's the case, it's not about what Elliot Abrams never tired of saying, we're willing to guarantee Maduro's safety. He can leave Venezuela with his wife, with his family. He can go any place he wants. It's not about Maduro, and it's not about Delcy Rodriguez. The possibility that the people who support them, the Chavistas, the rank and file Chavistas, will be killed, will be jailed, will be exiled on a mass basis, explains in my mind what Delcy Rodriguez's strategy is. And so I believe that there are a lot that we don't know about what's taking place in Venezuela, but I think the bottom line is that it's all about avoiding the possibility that the extreme right gain power in Venezuela as a result of the support of the Trump administration.
Really, really important and valuable information for listeners who, in particular, aren't necessarily super familiar with Venezuelan politics and the nature of the Venezuela opposition. So that naturally leads to my next question, which you've already gotten into, but I'm hoping we can unpack it in even greater depth. So we see in the past year, more people from outside Venezuela have become somewhat familiar with Maria Corina Machado. You were the first person to put her on my radar a few years ago. Now, I think her in particular, in getting into a conversation about the opposition, it's important to kind of address who she is as this really prominent figure and, I guess, the leader of the opposition. So how would you characterize her politically and historically within the political opposition movement? And then I have other follow-up questions about the opposition specifically, but just her as a figure, I think it would be really important for the listeners to hear your take on her, because certainly it informed my view.
Yeah, well, firstly, Alex, I think it's important to point out that she is supported by Washington, that she belongs to the fringe, the opposition fringe. She belongs to the radical right or the far right in Venezuela, and that this has been U.S. policy, at least under Maduro. They have consistently supported and prompted the leading members of the far right. Now, the entire, a big segment of the established opposition, I would call right wing because they're pro-neoliberal. But Maria Corina Machado represents the far right. I mean, her position is a massive privatization of the oil industry, which Delcy Rodriguez, incidentally, is not doing. I mean, she's implemented reforms in favor of foreign investments, but Maria Corina Machado favors the privatization of oil and just about everything else, the implementation of the voucher system in the field of education, et cetera. And, this has been standard. I say under Maduro, the U.S. government has supported the far right in Venezuela. But I would even go further back and say that this is standard U.S. policy. Throughout the Cold War, the United States always supported right-wing governments, with a few exceptions. Under Kennedy, briefly, there was some support for, moderates in Latin America. But this was, and the other exception, of course, is when the military dictators that the United States supports, when their position is getting eroded and it looks like they're going to get overthrown, then the United States supports some kind of option, as it did in Cuba under Batista in the last days of Batista, as it did in Venezuela in the last days of Pérez Jiménez in the 1950s. So this has been our policy. And in the case of Venezuela, our man in Caracas and our woman in Caracas has been right-wingers, beginning with Leopoldo López. I mentioned the Guarimba of 2014. He was the one that called for these protests, along with Maria Corina Machado, incidentally. They called for these protests in 2014. And Leopoldo López, followed by Juan Guaidó, who is, after López, our man in Caracas. So really, I mean, the U.S. State Department has supported three main leaders of the opposition under Maduro: Leopoldo López, Juan Guaidó, and Maria Corina Machado. And the three of them belong to the far right. López's party is called Voluntad Popular, and Juan Guaidó belongs to that party. The other members of what I'd call the established opposition, the bigger parties of the opposition, which in Venezuela is called the 4G, or the G4, they're rightist parties because they're neoliberal, but they're not far right. That's Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, Un Nuevo Tiempo, and Primera Justicia. They tend to be, less rightist than Machado, who, like I said before, promotes massive privatization. And her slogan, popular capitalism, was previously promoted by no one less than Pinochet in Chile. So this is the radical fringe of the opposition that the United States is supporting. Machado ran for in the opposition's primaries in 2012, and she got less than 4% of the vote. This was the opposition vote to choose the candidate to run against Chavez in 2012. Enrique Capriles won by a large majority of the vote, and he was the candidate against Chavez. But Machado got less than 4% of the vote. And the true colors of this radical opposition, specifically Maria Corina Machado in this case, was seen in Madrid just a few days ago when Carlos Baute, who is an entertainment personality, a Venezuelan figure in Madrid at a rally in favor of Maria Corina Machado, shouted out the slogan, Fuera la mona, get out, monkey, referring to Delcio Rodriguez. And after that, I'm sure the, Washington put the screws on Baute and on Machado, and the two of them, Baute apologized because he shouted out that. And Machado said, well, I'm not at fault. I didn't say that. But the fact of the matter is that the people in this rally, and there were hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand people there, and I saw it. I saw the video, and they all shouted out in unison, "Get out, monkey!" in reference to the acting president of Venezuela. So Washington has supported these far-right figures in Venezuela at the expense of the more moderate opposition. For instance, in 2024, after it became clear that Machado could not run for president, she was disabled for reasons I won't get into, but the Consejo Nacional Electoral prohibited her from running for president. The logical candidate, because the only other candidate that was really well known in Venezuela was Manuel Rosales, who is also opposition. He ran against Chavez for president in 2006. And he was governor of Zulia. And he was a logical choice, but he doesn't belong to the far right. He belongs to the right in the sense that he's a neoliberal, but he's more moderate in his discourse. And yet, Francisco Palmieri, who was the U.S. ambassador for Venezuela, working out of Bogota, stated clearly that for the United States, Machado is the candidate, and if she can't run, then she chooses who's going to be the candidate. And she chose a figure who was unknown, and not only unknown, but I don't want to use the word laughable because, it's a question in part of old age, but he really does not have the stamina to run for president of any country, and that's Edmundo Gonzalez. So Palmieri made clear that the United States didn't want a moderate member of the opposition. They wanted a member of the far right. And so this has been an ongoing tendency that takes in Democrats and Republicans in Washington. And let me just finish with regard to that question by pointing out that, I believe that when it comes to foreign policy, there's little difference between the Democrats and Republicans. And sometimes the Republicans actually have, in my opinion, better positions than Democrats, but it's logical that they are rivals, and so whatever the Democrats say, the Republicans oppose. But that in foreign policy, they pretty much say the same. And this became evident in 2020 at Trump's State of the Union message in Congress. when the Democrats didn't applaud anything that Trump said practically. Nancy Pelosi, I remember I saw it on TV. She was sitting, in back as Speaker of the House. She was sitting in back of Trump, along with the Vice President. And she, didn't stand up when the Republicans were standing up and applauding everything that Trump said. Practically the only exception was when Trump introduced Juan Guaido. He was there, and he stood up, and Nancy Pelosi stood up and clapped along with everybody else. So there is no question about it that with regard to Venezuela, the position of the Democrats is more or less the same. There are momentary differences, but the fundamental difference, which is the demonization of Maduro and acting on that basis, in that sense, there is no difference between the leading members of the Democratic Party and the Republicans.
I couldn't agree more with that last point. And I before I move on to my last few questions, I think it's really important to make how you made the audience aware that Corina Machado is a far right politician, a far right ideologue, and I think it was really important how you brought up this recent issue where they called Delcy Rodriguez Mona, because inherent to far right politics, it's not just about capitalism promoting free market economics, but there's an inherent racial and class dimension where that is the bread and butter of far right politics, right? A racialized vision of society, a hyper-individualistic and capitalistic vision of society, and a desire to reimpose extreme social hierarchy. And if you just read or view US media, all of that kind of gets eliminated and leveled, where the opposition is just really problematically presented as just this coherent, unified group of people seeking sort of democratic liberation. And I mean, if you just look anywhere beyond the surface, that's not true. But unfortunately, most people in the United States don't go beyond the surface level. But I digress. Now,
I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And this isn't one of my questions that I have on the script, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on. I can assume, but for some of our listeners might be wondering, why is it that the United States specifically supports the far right sectors of the opposition in Latin America, historically and contemporarily? I mean, you look at Argentina, Milei is certainly the far right. You look at Noboa in Ecuador, he's certainly far right. Why is it that the U.S. it's a bipartisan agreement seemingly in Congress, and whether we have a Democrat or a Republican president in the United States, we tend to support the far right political opposition in Latin America? Why is it specifically the far right, not the moderate right?
Well, I think it has to do with what I said before about imperialism. The far right is better for U.S. capital than the moderate sectors of on the political spectrum in Latin America. And I think that has a lot to do with really the overriding importance of imperialism for the system, for the reproduction of capital, as I mentioned before. And, if you look at somebody like Bernie Sanders he calls himself a socialist. He's obviously quite progressive, but he's mainly progressive on domestic issues. And that's what he talks about. And he has some good positions on foreign policy and other positions that aren't so good on foreign policy. I mean, he didn't speak out against genocide in Gaza from the outset. He does now, but he didn't at first. But in addition to that, his emphasis is domestic issues. And on domestic issues, he takes very progressive positions. And it seems to me it's revealing. And it was kind of surprising to me when he ran for president in 2016. I thought he was going to get clobbered by the mainstream media and by the establishment. And he wasn't. He was, I mean, Hillary Clinton, definitely she had the establishment of the Democratic Party on her side, and they played dirty. There's no question about that. And that was revealed by the dirty war against Bernie Sanders, which had a lot to do with the outcome of those primaries. But he wasn't demonized at all. And it seems to me that is revealing because it shows that a socialist can be given a certain space within domestic politics in the United States, but an anti-imperialist is not given that space at all. So the distinction is made between a progressive on economic issues in the United States and an anti-imperialist. And I think that applies, I think that answers your question in part at least, because it demonstrates how important imperialism is for the system, which is why the far right that supports policies favorable to US corporate interests is given so much support from Washington.
There's clearly support for Machado within parts of Venezuelan society, even as the opposition has struggled with internal fragmentation. But I'm curious, how unified is the opposition today in this post-kidnapping of Maduro moment? And what does that mean for its political viability, would you say?
I think that, firstly, it's got to be pointed out that the polarization in Venezuela is driven by the United States, but it's also driven by the hardcore opposition, the G4 that I mentioned before, the main parties of the opposition that from the very beginning of the Chavez government pushed for regime change. And that created a binary situation in Venezuelan politics in which, either you're for Chavez or you're in favor of his removal from office. No middle ground in terms of a critical support for Chavez or in terms of a loyal opposition. And you saw that, with the two regime change attempts in 2002, 2003, supported by the United States. And you saw that with the recall election in August of 2004, when the opposition did not accept the results, even though the Carter Center was in Venezuela. Jennifer McCoy, who's an expert on Venezuela, a leading academic who at the time worked for the Carter Center, and Jimmy Carter himself, they were in Venezuela to observe the process. They stated definitely, Carter went on TV in Venezuela. I remember seeing him on TV, and he stated these elections were fair, open, and honest. Nevertheless, the opposition did not accept the results. Maria Corina Machado became famous as a result of her statements as the vice president of Sumite, an NGO which was supported by, Washington. And then the 2005 elections that the opposition boycotted, and the mobilizations after every defeat. I mean, this is something that's somewhat unusual. Usually when somebody is defeated, they lay back for a while before they strike, they initiate actions at a later date. But in the case of the unsuccessful coup in 2002, immediately the opposition was rallying around the cry of no to impunity. After the 2006 elections, which Chavez won by 63% of the vote, the highest vote in the modern history of Venezuela. And yet, a few days later, the opposition was on the streets protesting, paralyzing Caracas. I was in Caracas at the time, and I remember I couldn't get around. I was invited someplace at nighttime, and all the roads were blocked. So that this is an ongoing process of the opposition, as supported by the United States, and it just generates a degree of polarization. But in addition to that, you have polarization within the opposition as of the year 2020. In 2020, the opposition's position of favoring electoral boycotts which was a complete disaster. Sectors of the opposition broke off, and it was promoted by the Maduro government. And the Maduro government engaged in measures that I consider to be unconstitutional, recognizing small splinter groups of Primero Justicia Voluntad Popular, Acción Democrática, less so because the splinter group was about half, maybe half of the party. But these splinter groups were recognized, achieved official recognition. And that pretty much that divided the opposition. But more recently, in 2024, the hardcore opposition, the G4 that I mentioned before, and other groups united around Machado's candidacy, that is the candidacy of Edmundo González Urrutia. But after that, and because of Trump, that opposition divided, because there were sectors of the opposition that didn't accept Maduro's anti-Venezuelan discourse, attacking Venezuelan immigrants, calling them criminals, the narrative connecting drug trafficking and immigration and criminality in the case of the Tren de Aragua, which Trump claimed Maduro was behind. But basically, he was smearing the image of all Venezuelan immigrants. And that created a division within the Venezuelan opposition and within the Venezuelan immigration population in the United States, even in Miami, because the older immigrants, the immigrants that arrived in Miami at an earlier date, who tended to be middle and upper class, they left Venezuela because they feared that Chávez was a communist and they wanted to get out. So by then, they were US citizens, and they continued to support Trump. But the immigrants who are in a more precarious situation, either because they don't have papers or they have other statuses that the Trump administration is threatening to revoke. So those people have become anti-Trump, critical of Trump, although in the United States they can't say it out loud, but there's a real division there in the Venezuelan immigration population. So you have all kinds of schisms. And the ex-candidate for president, who I mentioned before, Enrique Capriles, who was a candidate against Chavez in 2012 and then against Maduro the following year, he supported González in 2024, but has broken with that opposition with María Corina Machado. He favors electoral participation. He recognizes the Venezuelan government, and he criticizes Trump's narrative. So that polarization has a lot to do with Trump's rhetoric and actions.
With all of this in mind that we've talked about, what are the broader implications of all of these developments for Latin America and global politics in this new era of what I would call encroaching U.S. imperialism and potentially neo-fascism?
Yeah, Alex, I think that recent events in Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, in the case of Cuba, the tightening of the sanctions and the quarantine on the import of oil, which is, strangling the nation's economy, that these developments require a fresh analysis on the part of the left with regard to the question of how to evaluate governments that are targeted by Washington or under siege. And, you have two different extreme positions that are emerging and gradations between the two. But on the one hand, you have some who consider that any government that faces, U.S. hostility, that puts up resistance to U.S. aggression has to be praised. No other criteria is necessary. That's one position. Those people are being called, and I'm not at all in agreement with the term, they're getting called campists. That is, you've got two camps, the pro-imperialist camp and the anti-imperialist camp. and the anti-imperialist camp is headed by China. And so that anybody who defends that position that I just mentioned, is a campist because they're with China and they're opposed to the United States. I don't agree with the framing of the issue in those terms, because you can't compare China with the United States. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily pro-Chinese. But the New York Times has an article in today's paper about how the Chinese are facing the situation with Iran, with the export of oil, which the Chinese government is highly dependent on, and other countries in Southeast Asia dependent on oil from Iran, and how the Chinese government has exported and used renewable energy, such as they've exported solar farms, wind farms. They export, not only do they export this, solar panels, they're investing in other countries to create these farms, wind farms and solar farms. So you compare that with Trump's emphasis on oil and gas, natural gas. That's just one example of how I oppose any focus that says, well, a curse on both camps. China and the United States are one of the same. I don't agree with that. But on the other hand, the position that states that any country that faces U.S. imperialism should be praised, regardless of anything else, I would have an issue with the way they frame the issue. On the other hand, there are sectors on the left who demonize any government that doesn't, any leftist government, any progressive government, or socialist government that doesn't live up to the theoretical standards, the pie in the sky standards with regard to transformation, socialist transformation. That's the case of Maduro. He was demonized by some on the left. And I think it's got to be pointed out, as I mentioned before, that demonization is a prerequisite for imperialist aggression. So the demonization on the left by analysts and activists on the left, the demonization of Maduro fit into the Washington narrative that justified the sanctions against Venezuela and what came after that with the invasion on January 3rd, 2026. So those are two extremes. And I believe that this is the moment for debate, for discussion, open discussion, excluding terms like campism that I just mentioned, in a serious debate that recognizes, the cogent arguments of both sides. But I personally believe that a in-between position, a position that takes into consideration the progressive policies of countries like Cuba and Venezuela. And let me just add that the people who demonize Venezuela on the left are very often, most of them, are people who are glorifying Cuba. Even though Cuba and Venezuela are facing sanctions and they have the same kinds of problems, that these analysts are criticizing the case of Venezuela, but not in the case of Cuba. So I would say that the starting point for that discussion, that necessary discussion on the left, using what's happening in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba as a point of departure in order to analyze, much needed analysis about how to evaluate progressive governments. And I'm not saying by that the government of Iran is progressive, but the basic issue of how to analyze governments that are under siege. The starting point has to be that countries that are under siege, countries that are subject to these sanctions that these three countries are subject to. All the studies of sanctions indicate that countries that are in situations like that face problems of black markets that lead to corruption, and that therefore these countries have to be considered to be in a state of war, as Iran is right now. And war and democracy are incompatible. So that, just to end, if the United States was really serious about democracy in countries like Cuba and Venezuela, which Washington is not serious about, but if they were, they would have left Venezuela and Cuba alone a long time ago. And in that case, there would be the possibility of a democratic opening that would take place in an environment that is not subject to these sanctions and other types of warfare that Washington is carrying out against those countries.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today, but thank you for listening in. We've linked in the show notes to Steve's recent work on U.S. imperialism in Venezuela, which inform much of today's discussion. To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from Latin American perspectives, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app. If you're a student, academic, or activist interested in Latin America, or simply someone who wants to engage with rigorous, critical scholarship on the region, please consider subscribing to the journal. Your support helps sustain an important space for internationalist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial analysis. In a moment marked by renewed forms of U.S. intervention, rising authoritarianism, and growing geopolitical tensions, platforms like Latin American Perspectives remain essential for producing and amplifying critical perspectives on the region. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.